Greetings and welcome again to Midweek Meditation. I'm Dwayne Larson, and it is my delight to be with you and Rick Erickson, our cantor organist, this evening in sharing today on the theme of why Christian. And along the way, I want to talk about our incidents of suffering and the difference between empathy and compassion. I think God with us has something to do with that, about how we learn in all of that, and therefore what it means to be a Christian and why we would even want to. But without further ado, it's certainly fitting to hear now our deacon cantor organist Rick Erickson play for us the wonderful, beautiful hymn, If You But Trust in God to Guide You. said, I want to think out loud with you, not too much of a prepared script on the matter, but think out loud with you about why Christian, and to address the relationship along the way of empathy and compassion, and therefore have to touch on suffering and what God has to do with all that, and maybe in understanding a bit better what God does have to do with all that, we'll be able to answer our question. I'm struck by the question because I've asked it many, many times. That would be an understatement along the path of my 4 decades plus ministry career. One might ask, why am I a Christian today? Why am I a pastor today? Given the particular situations that meet me, how can I live to that? How can I be, in fact, a faithful follower? I think the question is even more urgent today because it's become ever more apparent that many ways of talking about why Christian, I will say forthrightly, have nothing to do with Christianity whatsoever. The old thing, of course, was maybe that's where so many of the leading people of the community will be, and it's just part of the social fabric. Well, that social fabric is wearing out, isn't it? We understand now, after the latest Gallup polls, that less than 50% of this country self-identify as Christian. That's an interesting phenomenon. I don't take it with so much fear as yet. I'm not worried about that. I'm thinking that maybe the definition of Christianity is coming to some clearer focus, because neither has it had anything to do with really the fear of death and so the securing of salvation beyond this world only. That was not the original impetus. And today we see lots of claimants about Christian, don't we, that align with clear hate speech, with clear exclusivity, trying to draw lines that would make society look ever more like the nightmare of The Handmaid's Tale. That's really on the precipice these days. I think it's something to be concerned about. But if I'm going to call myself Christian, I'd best understand what I'm arguing for in its most positive, put forward sense. I want to start with the age-old biblical understanding of why human. I think before we even ask why Christian, we have to ask why human and what is humankind? And there are some standard answers, aren't there? The most famous Jewish one may well be with Isaiah 40, which is also embedded in a way. Isaiah 40 itself is like Psalm 113. In Isaiah 40, we hear the prophet say this. He's being addressed ostensibly by God, who tells him to do something, and the prophet answers back and also provides some kind of thought bubbles to the audience. So Isaiah says, a voice cries, cry out. And I said, what shall I cry? That's the end of the quote. And then, as if thinking to himself for our sake, he goes on to say, all people are grass. Their constancy is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, when the breath of the Lord blows upon it. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. There's something there that's just kind of a take it as it goes sensibility that life is transient. And life, so to be understood as something of beauty and gift, is understood as the very gift of God. God gives it, and with God's breath it will go away, but God stands forever. I think St. Paul picks up on the same question about why Christian by first looking at why human, or what is human, when Paul too, in one of the most favored of texts, especially for funerals, writes this from Romans 8. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption. When we cry, Abba, Father, it is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if in fact we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. Oh, that last codicil. We probably often misread that. He says, we're heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if in fact we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. That if in fact is not a do this and then you will get that. This is a reference to the situation already prevalent. It is affirming that we already suffer. And so if we are suffering and we say, why human, why Christian? Well, he's saying, yes, indeed, we suffer. In fact, we suffer. We suffer with him. And in suffering with him, we may be glorified. Now, suffering with and feeling with. I've come across interesting conversations of late in ethics, especially ethics having to do with how military command should be working. And the question is around the distinction between empathy and compassion. They're not the same thing. Just think about it a bit. Empathy means to enter into a feeling with, pathos being feeling. Compassion means to be with suffering. Which do you think is the harder? Empathy can be a choice. Compassion is a choice, but it's one that has significant existential risk. To be with, that's calm, passion, suffering. By the way, that's also at the root of the word patience. Patience has to do with suffering as well. So there we are. There are some clues. Life is full of suffering, like the grass withers and the flower fades. It is that way. But if God has claimed us, adopted us as God's children, heirs of God's blessings, co-heirs with Christ, if we're suffering, which is the case, then we have the affirmation in a very deep way that God is with us because God's experiencing our suffering too, and that is the very denotation of God from the get-go at the crucifixion of Christ. This is the singular uniqueness and impact of Christianity, that God identified with our suffering in the suffering and death of Jesus Christ. It was not some kind of distant calculus so that thereby Jesus paid off some sort of debt to buy us out of Satan's clutches, or to pay what we could not in terms of what we in our sin owed. All those are medieval models that simply do not hold for us. What is the meaningful life? To be Christian is to suffer with each other and then find therein, so walking with each other truly, a liberation more unto the fullness of life now, knowing as well that it's secure for hereafter. That's what Jesus, I believe, was getting Thomas, miscalled Doubting Thomas, to come around to. Look, Thomas, these wounds, put your hands in them. feel that. See the wound in my side, in my hands, my feet. I still have them. I, in my woundedness, am one with you. And in your seeing that I so identify with you, I can so understand you, that you can truly feel like a liberation has come as a great gift in my presence and solidarity with you. It's a complex question, this thing of suffering, but it's a complexity we find on the other side of suffering that gives us an answer to why we belong to each other. Because we were given to each other to care as co-sufferers, not that we glory in the suffering, but that we find out in the very accompaniment and the putting of us all together in our various ways. We are stronger than ever. We are church together. We are healing agency together. This is where hope against hope has currency. It doesn't make immediate cognitive sense. It doesn't sound reasonable. But when we know the ease, the comforting voice of, say, Mother God with us in our hurts, we start to come out of it, don't we? We can start to deal with it. But if we don't name it, if we go to simple so-called rational mechanisms to say why we are what we are, as if there's some kind of abstract philosophical point to it all, without the real existential truth of it, the very feeling of it, the very palpability of our being with each other, if we don't get there, then Christianity has nothing to offer. I'll call myself Christian, and I will call others Christian, insofar as I have recognized in my suffering, your suffering, and in your suffering, Christ's suffering, and in all of it together, Christ with us. And thereby, since Christ is with us, it's the resurrected Christ who in our suffering, with our palpable wounds, gives us the hope against hope of what will be a life worth living for. Our anxiety today is not about sin so much. Clearly, look all around you and those who claim some sort of redemptive privileges. Sin abounds. I can't cast them as the only sinners, to be sure, but there's something almost tragicomic about that. And I can't say that it's just a matter now of needing to be saved from my anxiety. I am saved by Christ for the sake of a purposeful life of you and me and all of us together. Which is to say, in some closing, more formal words that I'll read that I wrote recently, faith and hope and community blossom where we are because of Christ's spirit of solidarity in our suffering with each other. That is a communion we would not want to trade. This community, from which I am speaking these words on this day, lives with a promise without end, and so do all of you in the community of Christ. A promise without end, notwithstanding all our travails. I must and I will trust that this community and others like it, and you, all of us together, will provide for me, and however distant I for you, the faith, hope, and love that I cannot have or sustain for myself. I believe for you. It is not personally covetous, but rather a sharing of the power of the cross of Jesus Christ, if you believe for me. And in all of that, we have purpose, and our suffering is transcendent. God be with you. The peace of Christ is with you.